In this lesson, we'll talk about Cinema 4D's Object Manager. So in Cinema 4D, the Object Manager is what we find here in this upper right-hand corner of the user interface. Now the Object Manager is really important inside of Cinema 4D. This is where you will do a lot of interacting with your objects, selecting objects, renaming, and so on. So let's take just a quick look at how we can start to use this Object Manager and how this factors into our everyday workflow of Cinema 4D. So let's start by just dropping in a couple of objects here. So we'll just click and hold, maybe drop in a cube, move that over to the side. We'll press and hold, maybe drop in a torus, move that over here, and click and hold, and let's maybe drop in a cone. There we go. Now let's also maybe add in maybe just something like a basic light. We'll talk about lights a little bit later in this course, but for now we'll just drop this in just for the sake of demonstrations, just so we can see sort of what we have here. So you'll notice that as we start to add these different objects and lights and pretty much everything into our scene, you'll notice that these objects start to populate inside of our Object Manager. So we can select objects here inside the viewport. We can also select them directly inside of this Object Manager. You'll notice that any objects that I have selected here also show up as being highlighted in orange here in my Object Manager. But like I said, I can also come in and select either individual objects. I can come in here and click and drag if I want to select multiple objects. I can also press and hold Control or Shift to select multiple objects or deselect certain objects. Okay, so really pretty straightforward, but there is a lot of power actually that can be found inside this Object Manager. So for example, you'll notice that a lot of these primitives have this little green checkbox next to them. Now certain objects you may not see this next to, but essentially this is something that shows up for any piece of geometry that Cinema 4D is generating within its internal application. So basically, with this turned on, that means that this piece of geometry, or whatever it is that we are looking at, is being generated. Now what I could do is set that to a little X. Now you'll notice with that set to a little red X, this piece of geometry still exists inside of our scene, but Cinema 4D is not actually generating anything here. So we can turn that on or off. We also have the ability to control whether or not an object is going to be visible inside either the viewport or by the renderer. Now inside of Cinema 4D, if you notice where this little green checkbox is, just to the left you have these two little gray dots stacked one right on top of the other. Now with these turned off with their default gray value, that really means that Cinema 4D is taking no action. But let's say, for example, maybe I wanted this cone to not be visible in the viewport. Well, this topmost dot is what controls the viewport visibility. So if I click on it once, that little dot turns green. Now that means that whatever this object is, it is now being specifically controlled or being specifically set to be visible in the viewport. So green means visible. If I click on that one more time, you'll notice that it turns red. Red means that it is now invisible. So you'll notice, again, the object is still in my scene. It is being calculated because it is still having this little green checkbox next to it, but with this little red dot, that means now it is no longer visible in a viewport. Okay, now if I come in and try to render this, let's start with just a quick little render view. You'll notice that that cone still shows up whenever I render. Now that's what this little bottom dot will do. So again, if I click once, that will set this to green, which means Cinema 4D specifically says this object will be visible in the renderer. If I click on it one more time, it turns red, which once again, if I come back and render view, now that cube, or that cone rather, is not seen in the render, and it's not seen in the viewport either. So we can have really all sorts of different combinations. Maxon will, a lot of times sort of in slang or in passing, we'll hear these referred to as traffic lights. So again, when it comes to traffic lights, the topmost light is what controls viewport visibility. The bottommost light controls render visibility. Now here's sort of a neat little feature. Let's say maybe I have a handful of objects that maybe I want to be visible in the viewport, but I don't want to show up in the render. What I could do is come in here, click once to set it to green, and now click and hold one more time to set it to red. But before I let off my mouse, I can now click and drag and basically paint that across all the other traffic lights. So now, by just clicking and dragging, it's now painted that red feature, or that red setting, onto the render of all the other objects. So now, once again, render view, none of my objects show up. If I want to get all of them back really quickly, once again, click and hold, and now whatever setting is currently active, if I click and drag, it will paint that setting across all the other traffic lights. So some really useful features that we have here. Now next to the traffic lights over here on the left, we have our layer settings. Now we're not going to go into layers just yet. We'll get into those a little bit later in this course whenever we get into some of the modeling and rigging features. But for now, these will be used as sort of color indicators whenever we set up layers inside of Cinema 4D. These can act as really great organizational tools for scenes that have dozens or maybe even hundreds of objects listed here inside of our Object Manager. Now inside of our Object Manager, we can also do the basic renaming of objects. So if I come in here and just do a double click on the name, we can come in here and set this to any name that we want to. In Cinema 4D, spaces are just fine. Certain 3D applications sometimes don't allow spaces. Cinema 4D is just fine with those. Cinema 4D can also have multiple objects share the exact same name. Most other applications won't let you do that, but again, Cinema 4D has no problem with that. Just be careful that sometimes if you come in and name an object, you want to make sure that you always give it a unique name, because if you try to give something else the exact same name, Cinema 4D is just fine with that. It won't give you any sort of warnings that that's no longer a unique name. Within this Object Manager, we can also come in and do any reordering of these. So let's say maybe I wanted this cone to be maybe toward the bottom of my stack here. Just simply click and drag. We can also start to set up object hierarchies inside of this Object Manager. So let's say maybe I wanted this cube and this cone to sort of move together. Whenever I grab one, I want the other to move along with it. So what we could do is take this cone, click and drag it right on top of this cube. And you'll notice my cursor changes to this little arrow that is pointing down. Once I let off, you can see now we have our cube, and this cone is sort of listed underneath it and sort of off to the side. That means that this cube is now basically a parent to my cone. So now if I grab the cube and move it, whenever we have a hierarchy like this set up, anytime you move the topmost object, any objects that are listed below will follow right along. Now, as we start to get into some of our later lessons in this course, into modeling and rigging and animation, you'll start to see where hierarchies play a really important part of Cinema 4D. But for now, just so that you're aware of how that is going to be set up, pretty straightforward. If at any point we no longer want this cone to follow along with the cube, just simply click, drag, and you'll notice that now my cursor, whenever I move to a certain point, changes to this little sideways arrow. Once I let off, now you can see my cone is no longer part of the cube. Now, a couple quick things that I want to show you before we wrap up this lesson is up here toward the top of your Object Manager, we have a few little buttons up here. Now, these can actually be really useful. First of all, we have the ability to search. Now, this is why it sometimes becomes important to come in and actually rename your objects and rename them in some kind of a unique way to where they're easily identifiable. That way, as you start to get into really complex scenes that maybe have hundreds of nodes listed in here, if maybe you're having trouble finding the one that you're looking for, we can come in here and just go to search and just type in whatever we want. So let's say my, and immediately you can see it filters out anything with the word my. So here's my cone, and there we go. Now, if at any point in time I'm ready to clear that out, we can just go ahead and click on this little X. That will clear out the search results and get everything back. Now here's something that you want to be really careful about. Let's say, for example, we are searching and we go to search for the term my. There we go. Now, without closing this, we can still close out the search bar. So now when I click on the search bar one more time, it collapses, and now I'm left with only my cone visible here in the Object Manager. So be very aware of this, because sometimes you may be working along and then wonder why everything seems to have disappeared. Well, it's probably, again, because maybe you've used your search, and before you closed out the search bar, maybe you forgot to clear out your search results. So anytime you've got this open, make it a habit, clear your search results, and then close out your search. And now we've got everything back. We can also come in here and maybe just start to filter what we see here based on object types. So this is going to be this little closed eye icon. Whenever we click on this, the little eye opens up. And this is where we can start to see maybe different objects. If we expand this, we can see different cones. If we have any layers, things like that, these become really useful. So in my case, you can see I have a single cube, a single cone, a single light. But let's say maybe we drop in another light. Okay, so there's my other one. So you can see now I have two lights here in my Object Manager. But if I take a look again inside this filtered result, inside of light, you can see I have one of two lights selected. So the first one, the first number that you see here, shows how many of the objects you have selected. In my case, I just have one. But I actually have two lights in my scene. So this becomes really sort of useful as a way of looking at different objects. If I double click on this light, you can see now it selects both of them for me. So this becomes a really useful way of, if I have multiple cones and I want to grab them all at the same time, I can just double click once, and now all of my cones, wherever they are in my scene, can be selected. I could also come in here and maybe just hide certain objects, again, from the Object Manager. So let's say I have lights, a bunch of lights that I really don't want cluttering up. I can come in here, turn off their display here, and now as far as the Object Manager is concerned, those are no longer being displayed. Again, the lights still exist here in my scene. I'm just not cluttering up my Object Manager with a bunch of stuff that I may not need. Becomes really useful if you're trying to find a certain something in your scene, or a certain object that maybe you're having just a little bit of difficulty finding. Now, as we start to get further along in this course, you're going to find yourself using the Object Manager a lot. It's going to become a very familiar, very frequently used area of Cinema 4D. So for now, that's just a quick look at some of the major features that can be found inside of this Object Manager.